Pentagon found that it had overestimated the amount of funding for ammunition, missiles, and other equipment it sent to Ukraine by $6.2 billion due to an accounting error. Let's listen.
Following up from some announcements earlier this year, during the department's regular oversight of our execution of Presidential Drawdown Authority for Ukraine, we discovered inconsistencies in equipment valuation for Ukraine. In a significant number of cases, services used replacement costs rather than net book value, thereby overestimating the value of the equipment drawn down from U.S. stocks and provided to Ukraine. Once we discovered this misvaluation, the comptroller reissued guidance on March 31st, clarifying how to value equipment in line with the financial management regulation and DoD policy to ensure we use the most accurate of accounting methods. We have confirmed that for FY23, the final calculation is $3.6 billion, and for FY22, it is $2.6 billion, for a combined total of $6.2 billion. These valuation errors in no way limit or restricted the size of any of our PDAs or impacted the provision of support to Ukraine. And while the DoD retains the authority to utilize the recaptured PDA, this has no bearing on appropriated USAI or Ukraine PDA replenishment funding approved by Congress.
Journalist Aaron Mate spoke for us all, I think, when he responded, yet another accounting error frees up billions of more dollars for the Ukraine proxy war. How come these errors never free up any money for U.S. healthcare or the unhoused?
Yes. So as that Anne Hathaway lookalike told us, they have gotten some more money. You know, how nice for them. It's like they drew that community chess card in Monopoly. Bank error in your favor, collect $200. Mm-hmm. Lucky, lucky, lucky.
Yeah, incredibly lucky. Remember,
I wish the Pentagon would accidentally give me $6 billion.
Well, they might, because remember, the Pentagon in November of last year failed its 5th consecutive audit.
Yes.
They were unable to account for 61% of its $3.5 trillion in assets. Now, when we're thinking about what the scale of that $6.2 billion that they've just come up with and then are sending to Ukraine, what is that? Well, that's almost as big as Mexico's entire military national defense budget, which is $7.2 billion. And lest we forget, America's military budget is bigger than the next 10 countries' military budgets combined.
Right. That audit was for $3.5 trillion in assets with a T, $3.7 trillion in liabilities. Department officials couldn't account for 61% of it. I remember, when the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were more active, the routine auditing failures, mismanagement of money, they lost so much money in those conflicts, money they couldn't account for, where it was spent, what it was used to build, where the weapons went, probably picked up by our enemies, et cetera, and so on. So this is not actually at all surprising. The government is not great at managing money, least of all this aspect of it, the Pentagon.
Yeah, well, it's worth noting that this kind of malpractice is not a government-wide phenomenon. It is specifically disproportionately bad in the context of the American military. And I don't think it's that difficult to understand why that is, or how this just happens to keep happening in this one sector of government. Now imagine if you found out that the Social Security money, 62% of it, or 60 whatever percent of funds being paid into Social Security was going missing, or HUD somehow lost 60% of its budget and it couldn't account for it. In fact, one of the most efficient parts of our government, wait a minute, this is a fact. One of the most efficient parts of our government is in fact Medicare, which is why it is such a highly ranked and highly esteemed program in the context of the United States. And the administration of that program is a model potentially for all of the waste and abuse that happens in the private healthcare industries, where a lot of the savings would come from if we did switch to a Medicare for all style program. Now, some other commentators like Stephen Simler, who does a lot of great criticism of U.S. imperialism and the problems with our war budget, pointed out that Biden's 2024 budget proposal includes an additional $886 billion for the Pentagon, a mere $26 billion to fight climate change. That's their emissions mitigation program. He describes it as tantamount to climate denial and is certainly out of step with how the Democratic Party holds itself out as a pro-climate party, a party that's being serious about climate change, in contrast to Republicans, and also ignores the fact that the military the U.S. military is one of the world's biggest polluters.
Mm-hmm. There are auditing issues in other government branches, but I will accept that the Pentagon has been uniquely bad on this front.
And want to hazard a guess as to why?
Why, Briahna?
Well, let's go back to some more of these Stephen Simler quotes about how much military contractors, again, another huge donor to the government and a huge part of the socialism of the American government here. It's socialism for military contractors and the like. Money is funneling from these defense budgets directly to some of the richest, most influential lobbying groups in the United States of America. We have a country where military contractors can expect $470 billion from the bipartisan budget agreement in 2024. And this money is going right down the drain and happens to be getting lost in the sector where there's so much fraud and abuse.
And the bipartisan nature is the real issue.
Yep.
Democrats are not overly exercised about government accounting in general. Republicans could weaponize this, could say, wasting taxpayer dollars, but because it's for defense, they have this blind spot where they're like, well, whatever, defense, so what if you lose $6 billion? I hope this is used as a wedge issue by Republicans who seem willing to countenance some different foreign policy strategy with respect to Ukraine. So let's follow through on that and talk about how there should be different policy changes with the budget being allocated to Ukraine, or that it should come with some strings, or this should be the last time. And we say you have to sit down at the negotiating table and not bring us ever closer to the precipice of World War III.
Yeah.
But it's really, it's because of the bipartisan nature. It's not something that either side wants to talk about or talks about nearly enough. And as you said, this is the fifth audit they failed in a row.
Yes.
This is the first we're hearing of this, that the Pentagon doesn't know the money it's spending abroad. It happens every year.
I'm sorry, we're not going to hear the fiscal conservatives in the Republican Party up in arms about this either. We just finished
I wish we would.
negotiating the so-called debt ceiling crisis, in which Republican after Republican averred that we have a spending problem, not a revenue problem, but then turned around after criticizing the war in Ukraine, declined to actually say they would cut the military budget. We talked to Marjorie Taylor Greene about this right here on this program. You'll say things rhetorically that sound like you're interested in cutting defense spending, cutting our investment in Ukraine so that you can do more domestic spending. But at the end of the day, when we're literally in the middle of a negotiation to do exactly that, to recalibrate what our spending priorities are, there is this bipartisan protection of the defense budget at all costs and an incredible willingness to immediately cut the kinds of social safety net programs that disproportionately affect the poorest and most vulnerable people in the United States of America. And what does it mean about us as a country when we have the biggest military budget in the world by a factor of 10? And on top of that, have the worst health outcomes in the world, even though we spend more per person on health care than any other industrialized nation.
Why is there no accountability? This happens every year. Shouldn't the head of the Department of Defense resign in embarrassment after losing billions of dollars?
Where's the hearing on that?
Yeah, let's get on that.
And I would like to hear some more clarity from some of the presidential candidates on this as well. It is at this point kind of easy to message that you're in the right place or on the populist place on being anti-war, et cetera. But I want to hear more specific commitments about how much of the military budget they intend to cut, on what sort of a timeline, who is going to be responsible for all of these sorts of failed audits, the kind of hearings that they expect to see, and the kind of accountability. RFK Jr., people who are at Marianne, who are both talking a lot about corruption and the capture of these kinds of agencies. Are we also going to specifically talk about all the money that's going to defense contractors and private industry and how they are profiting enormously while Americans are suffering at home?
The Libertarian Party's presidential candidate in the last few cycles had a plan to cut the military budget by 50%, which sounds like a good start to me.
Yeah.
More Rising right after this.